Here know who Andrew is. I don't think I need a long introduction, except for the fact that Andrew has really worked on a lot of great stuff. And when I look down his partial list, it's like, man, this is so cool. Green Day, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Weezer, Black Sabbath, Metallica, Linkin Park, Hozier, U2. Boy, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Um, he's won 3 Grammys. That's pretty cool.
And by this time tomorrow, maybe there'll be a fourth. We'll see. We'll see. I'm nominated for the Tenariwen record in the world music category. If you have not heard Tenariwen, everybody in this room has to promise to listen to at least one song from Tenariwen. It doesn't even have to be the record I did. It doesn't matter. They're amazing. They're a Tuareg band from the African desert. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. So, yeah, anyway.
Well, with that, since we've already started,
Did I cut you off?
I give you Andrew Scheps.
Thanks, Bobby. So what are we doing? Is this just Q and A the whole time? I got nothing in particular I wanted to say. So, is there anything you would like me to talk about, Bobby?
No,
You got anything in mind?
it's completely open. However you guys would like it to work, it's going to work that way. Um, Andrew is. Actually, let me give you some background on this lunch thing here. This was really going to be lunch once upon a time, where there's going to be a break, so people like me won't have to be here all day and can actually get off for 45 minutes. And then they came to me and he says, "We want you to book lunch with Higgs." I said, "What is a Hig?" And they said, "Huge industry giant."
It's a little redundant, isn't it?
And so basically, the idea is a Hig would come in, and there'd be a lot of people that would come in also because of that and would like to ask lots of questions. So here we are with a Hig, with Andrew
Wow.
Scheps.
And I suppose if we actually had food, I'd have to speak with my mouth full,
Yeah.
which is one of the things I hate, and I wouldn't enjoy that. So I wouldn't end up eating. So I think this is the right way to do it.
Okay. I'd like to actually. Oh, yeah.
There
And
are
it
more
figures we're at a sound
Yeah.
convention and the sound doesn't work. I'd actually like to start this off on something that you just mentioned. Then you guys can take it. Um, you mentioned what's the band that's nominated?
Tenariwen.
Okay. Did you record as well as me?
I did not. No, they recorded it in the desert in tents with generators. I mean, this is a band. Just a little tiny bit of background. So, a very traditional African band. It's a very specific style of music, and they are amazing. If you see them live, they're in traditional dress. The grooves sound like they've been going since the earth was formed, and they just happen to tap into it for a minute, do their thing. It's all call and response vocals, and that goes away, and then the next groove starts. But they're from a part of the world that has been in civil war for hundreds of years, most likely. And because they have backgrounds as being protesters and things like that, they actually can't travel sometimes. So they will book a tour and then find out that it's not safe for them to try and get out of the country. But rather than deciding to live in Europe or something like that, which they could certainly do, they go back. And they always go back because it's where they're from. And so there's this huge sort of it's not even an undercurrent, but there's this backdrop of sort of one of the worst versions of the horribleness of what humans do behind their music. But their music is just full of joy, and their performances are amazing, and they're not out there as a protest band. It's not. I'm sure Tom Morello is a big fan, but it's not his Night Watchman, I'm gonna come call you out on your shit. It's this is our culture, we do what we do, but at the same time, I can't leave the desert. So that's the kind of
Okay,
thing
so
behind the band.
my question then is, I just went through a list of rock bands that you did, rock acts. Is your approach to world music the same when you're mixing? I mean, do you do a lot of parallel compression on the bouzouki and things like that?
Yeah, it's exactly the same. And it's a weird, like my discography is weird, and I know that. It's all over the place. I mean, I've done a Barry Manilow record. It's like
Oh yeah. Oh,
it's
that's way down on the credit list.
it's yeah, it goes down. But I mean, it was with full orchestra and it was whatever. So I work on all kinds of stuff, and some of the stuff I'm actually proudest of are things that not terribly successful, and certainly not even in a genre I would normally work. I mixed a jazz record for Jeff Babco, who's an LA keyboard player. He's one of my favorite musicians of all time. I mixed a classical record for Sarah Snyder, who's a contemporary classical composer in New York. Really unbelievably proud of that record and being able to do it. And the mix techniques are exactly the same on those records as the Chili Peppers or Green Day. It's where does the rhythm come from? Where does the power come from? How do I make this sound exciting even on little speakers? It's always the same. It's always the same. When you get to whatever acts like the chorus, which is the emotional payoff, how do I make you excited and want to listen again? And so technically you end up doing the same thing. Like an example on the Tenariwen record is there's hand percussion. There are no drums. So there's djembe and things like that that have low end, and I would have to find where in the percussion I could treat it as a kick drum, because that's what was going to drive the rhythm of the track. And then you've got lots of hand claps and shakers and lots of top end percussion. And there's actually a song where I was adding a sample of a kick drum just to get extra low end, but just so that I could make it have a kick drum pattern. And halfway through one of the songs, I'm actually changing which accents I'm using to trigger the kick drum, because so much changed in the rhythm of the guitars that it went from this sort of lilting African rhythm into almost a four on the floor real driving rhythm. So that's exactly the sort of thing I would do on a hip hop track, to make sure that the rhythm is there. And it's the same with orchestral percussion. When that hits, it needs to have huge impact and big transients. And so yeah, it's exactly the same template and approach on every single thing I mix. And I may use different bits of the template or whatever, but the approach for me is everything. I used to say that I want everything to feel like a rock band, but I've realized I want everything to feel like a rock band playing live through a massive PA. Like that's what I want when I listen to stuff. Because for me, when you go to a concert, and it always happens about 5 minutes before the show actually starts, someone goes on stage, they unmute the PA, and they hit the kick drum. And that sound, that huge, loud sound with the subs shaking your chest, is one of the best things ever for me. And so that's what I'm trying to get every single mix I do to feel like.
It's funny you should mention that. Recently, I don't remember where it was, but I saw Kiss doing a benefit, and they were in a small club, and they sounded very much like a small club band that was just starting out. When you took the arena background, the arena sound away, you took the Kiss out of Kiss, so to speak, the cool stuff. They were surprisingly common,
Right.
and that's what you're doing. You're taking a club sound to an arena sound, essentially.
Well, yeah, because it's. I think the other thing is there's always this balance of something sounding natural, because that's what makes humans connect to it. When you listen to a vocal, if it's super processed, you might think it's really cool, but you don't get the emotion from the singer there because you've processed it out. And that can be processing with crazy stuff, or it can just be compressing it a lot. It makes it less natural, and so you don't have the personal connection to the performance. But then it's also marrying that with this unnatural, bigger than life version of things. Like the Green Day record I mixed, I could have mixed it very old school, smaller, because they tracked the record that way. They were looking for recapturing more of their Dookie era stuff, which is, man, we're just a band and we're going to play and that's it. Not we're American Idiot and we're going to turn it into a musical of a movie, of a musical of a play, of a musical. Like, they really were trying to recapture themselves as band. And I started mixing the record that way. But that's not who they are. They bring the arena with them. They're always in an arena because they are so good and so powerful, and those songs are built for that kind of sound. So the record ended up being bigger sounding than I thought it was going to. I thought it was going to be like a real cool, as you say, almost small club version of Green Day, and it didn't make any sense.
They were cool with it.
Yeah, no, we never even talked about it. Like I just sent the first mixes and they were where I had ended up with them, and they're like great, and we kept going, you know. So, and it was a decision because one of the first songs I worked on was Bang Bang, which has this huge drum fill in the outro. So everything stops and Trey goes crazy, and when that wasn't sounding like a stadium, it just wasn't exciting. And like, oh, all right, there you go. That's what we're doing now. And it made sense for the songs and, you know, that way. Because you can certainly do a small, intimate record, and that can be even more powerful. But it has to be that kind of record. You can't force a record to be anything. And that record wanted to be big Green Day, because that's who they are now. They're a punk band that fills stadiums for multiple nights in different cities.
Yeah.
So that's what they were writing, that's what they were performing, so that's what it needed to feel like.
And probably used to by this time. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and it's hard to know what they were responding to with it, but I think just the energy of it, like the small club energy, doesn't make sense for the way they write
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you mentioned before about overcompressing.
And I'm guilty.
Yeah, but the question is, so what is that? Is there a point to you where what does it sound like when you hit that point to you? It's different for everybody how they feel that, and when you ask somebody how much do you compress, generally everyone will say, great mixer will say, well, as much as it needs, which you know is one thing to one person and one thing to
Yeah.
another. So to you, what does that mean?
To me, it's, I mean, there are audio artifacts to overcompressing. Things just go nasal. You lose low end in a vocal or something like that. So there's that side of it. But it's much more to me about what I was saying before, the emotional connection to it. If you just listen to a great vocal take completely dry and then you start compressing it, you'll start to get the dynamic range where you need it to fit in the mix, and it will start to work with things better. But then at some point, you go from having that singer here to the singer being back there. And if that's not what you want, usually that's compression. And this is why I use parallel compression all the time, because you've always got that uncompressed vocal, and then you're getting the benefits of compressing, which is making the dynamic range smaller, but you're doing it without affecting the actual uncompressed performance. You're blending in a compressed version, so that does the job for you, but you still get the sound of the tongue against the back of the teeth and all that stuff, which when you're really compressing, that stuff is so unnaturally loud or missing that it no longer feels like a person. It's more of an instrument playing the melody that happens to sound like a person, I guess.
You use parallel compression more than most engineers. I'm curious, is that do you exclusively use parallel compression?
Yeah, well, not exclusively, no. I mean, I compress stuff directly, but not often. Not often. No, it's only when I'm compressing something to put a compressor on something, I'm not mixing at that point. I'm changing the way something sounds so that then I can mix it with other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's for an effect, or with a vocal, there are reasons to do it. Like if you put a really aggressive compressor with a fast release on a vocal, it will sound more aggressive. So if you've got a rock track, you're not looking for a very natural dynamic. You need to hear every single syllable over cymbals and distorted guitars, and a great way to do that is to compress aggressively, but a little bit less than you might otherwise, because I also have some parallel stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
No, I haven't checked out your new channel strip.
It has a compressor in it.
I'm sure it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it Omni Strip? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, the Omni channel.
Omni Channel. But is it capable? And it must. It's probably a stupid question, but it must be capable of doing parallel compression, right?
Not really, actually. Well, there's a wet-dry control on the compressor,
Okay.
which is sort of kind of the same thing, but it's implemented completely differently. Because if you parallel compress the way I do, you've got your uncompressed thing that's on a fader, and that's the level it is. Then you've got a second fader where you start to blend in this really compressed version of it. And that's it. So your uncompressed thing is always the same level. It's always there 100%. With a wet-dry knob, as you turn more to wet, your uncompressed gets turned down as your compressed gets turned up. So it's a very different thing, but it's because the other thing about the way I use parallel compression is I'm never parallel compressing one thing. There are multiple things going into that compressor. So a channel strip is an insert compressor. You're compressing something. So it was more, I like the compression character I'm getting by how much I'm crushing it, but it's a little too much, so you can back it off with a wet dry knob. It's a different thing.
Okay, so that being said, do you compress when you're doing parallel compression? Does the compression channel have more compression than you would normally use if you were just inserting it on the
Oh,
channel?
absolutely. Things are getting crushed. That's the whole point because
Yeah.
you're only going to use a little bit of it. So yeah, I've explained this so many times this week. I feel like everybody must
Yeah,
have heard
well,
it from
I'm
me
sorry
once.
for being
No, no, no,
redundant.
no.
Yeah.
It's fine. But so the concept is, if you just compress something, the way a compressor works is you've got a threshold control, right? And that threshold is set to a volume. And what it says is anything that comes into this compressor that's less than this volume, leave it alone. Anything that's louder than that volume, turn it down. And you turn it down based on the attack and the release and the ratio, blah, 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 blah. So you've got a waveform that's originally this big, and that's too much dynamic range. It's not going to work in a mix, so you need to make it that big. So with a compressor, you're making it that big by taking the top and pushing it down. So you leave the quiet stuff alone because it's below the threshold, and you bring the quiet stuff down. But that changes the sound of the loud stuff. So that's the attack of the snare drum. That's the loud plosives of the vocal. It's all of the stuff that might be the thing you actually want to keep. So the way you can compress that dynamic range instead is to take the quiet stuff and make it louder. And you do that by smashing it, putting it on another channel, blend that in, and that has the effect of leaving the loud stuff alone and bringing up the quiet stuff. So it's the same idea of making the dynamic range smaller. It just does it from underneath instead of from above. And apparently that has spawned confusion.
Just hang on for a second, Keith. So, okay, so let me ask you then: if you have a track that is particularly dynamic, does that mean that you're going to limit it, compress it, just to put it under control with an insert, and then parallel compress it as well?
Maybe, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if the track on its own is just crazy dynamic and I know that's going to be an issue, then yeah, I'll compress it. But then that compressed version probably wouldn't be as compressed as it might be because it's also going to go off to some parallel stuff. So you do a little bit of control work and then you get the parallel thing to bring it down even more. But not just based on the loud stuff. Because the loud stuff is what you hear. You know, the quiet stuff is the bleed from other drums into the snare mic and things like that, the decay of the cymbals. Leaving that alone, who cares? What you might want to leave alone is the transient crack of that snare drum. And you cannot leave it alone if you just put a compressor on it. That's what you're changing. And sometimes that's what you want to do because it changes the character of the drum. I mean, but that's a sound shaping thing. That's not a dynamic range control
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. Keith, you had a question?
Yeah. So once you've got both those parts set up, you've got your uncompressed and your parallel compression. Which one of those do you normally ride when you're doing the automation towards the end of the mix to sort of keep something?
Always the uncompressed, because the way it goes is you've got your tracks, and those have a send that's post fader off to these parallel compressors. So that means when I turn up the uncompressed, it also sends a little bit more to the parallel compressor, which means that I can't just turn it up half a dB, because if I turn up a fader half a dB, I'm also getting more parallel compression, so it's probably coming up a dB, dB and a half. I mean, who the hell knows? I don't know. So the numbers are completely unimportant, but that way you just ride the one fader that is the source, but you don't have to ride it as much.
In terms of the parallel one, do you keep that in the same panning position, or do you do anything else?
No, no, no. Yeah, that's always fine. It's part of the sound. So in Pro Tools, you can default every send you make to being at 0, post fader, and following the pan pot. And that's how they're all set up. Every once in a while, I'll get clever and do something else, but it's always a mistake and it sounds terrible. So yes, it's basically what you're doing is each parallel compressor has got lots of things going into it. You're just taking a copy of the mix and shoving it into that compressor. And then you're taking a copy of these 40 faders of the mix and putting them into that compressor. And then you're taking just the vocals and putting them into that compressor. But it's always just lifting a copy. So it's after any inserts you've put on the tracks and post faders. So whatever you do on the source track happens in the parallel as well.
What do some of your subgroups look like? You said you never have one thing who's down there.
Well, like, I mean, drum kit, there's a shared one for kick and snare, and then there are 2 or 3 stereo ones for either the rest of the kit or the entire kit, or the kit without the kick and snare but with percussion, or with strumming acoustic guitars because I want them to pump along with the drums, something like that. There's always a stereo one that's for the whole mix except the drums. And then there are a couple that are for vocals, but then I'll just try putting other stuff in them, and then sometimes I build some just for all the guitars because I want them to interact more. Because what you get is not just, oh, dynamic range is smaller. As soon as multiple things are going in, they start to interact in that compressor, and they actually interact in your mix. So it's things balance themselves. Whoever is loudest controls the parallel compression on everything else. So it's that much louder in the balance. So it's like micro riding everything based on performance. So
Compressors for doing that?
you can use anything. And the only mistake you can make is to listen to that compressor on its own and think you know what it's going to sound like when you blend it in, because it doesn't work that way. I think I said this morning at the Mix of the Masters booth, like if you put a Fairchild as a drum parallel compressor, you would think it's going to have a lot of meat and low end to it, be a little slow and mushy. Invariably, for some reason, it ends up being really bright. And it's just the way stuff adds together. So there's no point in pretending like you know what parallel compressor you should use. Just sort by type and try every single compressor that you own and see what sounds cool.
So this is essentially the New York City compression trick. If anybody, if you've read my book, Mixing Engineer's Handbook, that I don't know if you know about this, but every guy from New York, every mixer that I knew had the same trick. And so I didn't know what to call it, so I just said the New York City compression trick. And basically what it is what you're talking about. It's the drums and the bass, the rhythm section, that go into parallel compression.
Right.
And it does the same thing, only we're talking about the rhythm section. And the thing about it is, then it sort of got out in the wild, and it's on the internet, but it's only using the drums. It's parallel compression on the full drum mix. But that wasn't the trick that everybody used. It was at least having the bass in there as well, and maybe some other things too.
I mean, also, just if you think about a simple benefit of it, is if you put the kick drum and the bass, nothing else. And most pop or rock songs, the pattern of the kick drum and the bass line have something to do with each other. They don't always hit at the same time, but they hit a lot at the same time. And I'm a fan of human performances and things like that, so assume not everything is lined up. If you put compression on both of those to bring out the attack, now every time there's a flam between them, which would be almost all of the time, that flam is accentuated because everybody has lots and lots of attack. If you send them off to the same parallel compressor, whoever gets there first, their attack gets through, and then the compressor clamps down and the second guy's held down. So it immediately makes the groove tighter. Immediately, but you still hear the bass come a little bit after the kick drum, but it doesn't have a click on the front, which is disturbing and actually takes you out of the groove. That's the microcosm version of putting everything except the drums into a mix. Because now, when you hit the downbeat of a chorus, every single guitar, the bass, the vocals, everything, whoever gets there first, that's when the downbeat happens and everybody else happens around it.
Okay, here's a question for you then. How do you set up the attack and release control on a parallel compressor, since that's very important? How you would if it was on an insert, then you would try to time it with the track so it pumps and
Generally it's a slow attack and a fast release, and I don't know what those numbers would be. I have
is
no
it
idea.
a default setting that you're using, or is it just
Well,
your default?
if I was going to use an 1176, it would be the slowest attack and the fastest release, because that's when I think 1176s sound cool.
Yeah.
And I mean, that would be it. So the general idea is it's slow enough that if there's a transient that happens to get over there, it can make it through. But it's a fast enough release that it forgets about what just happened and tries to figure out what's happening next. Because if you think about sending 60 tracks of your mix to one compressor, that's a lot of stuff for the compressor to look at, so you want it reacting as much as possible. But if you have a really fast attack, it's just going to be clamping down on everything. So you need to balance the need for stuff to get through with the need for it to recover so we can look for the next thing that it wants to react to.
Okay, so that being said, does that mean you need less master bus compression as a result? Or no master bus compression?
I mean, I actually, about 6 weeks ago, finally pulled the compressor out of my template. For the first time in years and years and years, I no longer have a compressor on the bus. I'm limiting the hell out of it.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
but no, I actually got rid of it because what I was finding was the compressor lends so much character to the mix in a good way usually, but I was getting kind of stuck where everything felt the same, and I don't like that. I want it to be based really upon the source material, and each song can do anything it wants to do. And I finally got so fed up with it that I got rid of it. And the way to do that, by the way, if you feel like you're relying on something that's in your template, any compressor has makeup gain. Make sure that when you bypass it, it's actually a little louder. Or exactly the same level, which is difficult to do. But if you make sure that when you put the compressor in, your level actually drops a little bit, you need to love the way it sounds compressed to actually like it better. Because louder will always sound better when you do ABs. So that's what I did. I dropped the makeup gain 1 click. And like, oh, nope, I actually don't like what it's doing. Because otherwise you just get fooled. You put the compressor in, it's louder, like, yeah, it must be better. But it wasn't, so it's gone.
Okay, you mentioned your template before. On my podcast last week, I think, I interviewed a mixer called Billy Decker from Nashville, and he has lots of #1 hits. He does all of his mixing in 2 to 3 hours. Nothing goes beyond that. Mostly because he uses an in-the-box version of the Chris Lord Algae method, where he has a template and he knows exactly what processing and EQ and whatever is going to be on this guitar and that guitar and hi-hat and whatever. He plugs the tracks in, and then he looks at the waveform, and it's the right level, and there's his mix, and he gets it in a flash, and nobody complains because he has #1 hits. So how is your template? Is your
Yeah,
template something similar?
It's the same thing, but 2-3 hours. I'm 20 minutes tops. That is such a lie. My template is all parallel stuff, so it sends. It's all parallel compressors and a couple of reverbs, few delays, some distortion. It's all parallel things. I have no set anything that I would use on a track ever. That stuff's always done from scratch. I have no idea how long it takes me to mix a song because I don't sit down and mix a song anymore. I mix until I'm bored or stuck, and then I go on to the next song. And eventually, I'll circle back to that song and have no idea how far I got, have a listen, and go on from there. So, I mean, I think I do mix relatively quickly, but it's only because I've been doing it for 30 years. So I'm used to doing it. So when I hear something I don't like, I know exactly where to start to fix it and make it what I want it to be. But I get stuck. Sometimes there are mixes that take me days and days. And it's not because it's badly recorded or there's something wrong. There's something I want it to do, and I can't get it to happen. I want the hairs to stand up when I make it to the bridge. And it's just, I can tell like musically it should happen, and I can't make it happen. And then finally, who knows what the hell you do, and then it starts happening. So that could take a really, really long time.
But see, what you're talking about is the difference between a mixer like you and another mixer that hasn't risen to that level. Because anybody can balance faders up. It's a matter of taking it to that next level where you're emotionally putting something into it that wasn't there before, or you're bringing it out.
Yeah. Or you stop taking it out because it was there, and you're destroying it by mixing it, which happens a lot. This is that, the uncompressed dry vocal take can be heartbreaking, but it's not going to work in the mix because it's actually a big arrangement. So you've got to process the vocals. So how do you do that without ruining it? And that's the difficult part.
When you have a mix that has like a ton of different guitar parts, and I'm not talking about where you have a lot of options, microphone options or something. I'm talking about distinctly different parts, or doubles or triples or whatever. How do you deal with that?
I generally start with wherever it was left. I'm assuming that the session, the way it comes to me, is panned and balanced in a way that it makes sense, and then I go from there. So I try and understand what came to me, and every once in a while we'll realize like those two guys are really fighting, and then I'll adjust panning a little bit or try and EQ a bit, and if I really can't make it work, I'll get rid of something. and then say, by the way, I thinned out the guitars in the chorus. If you miss it, let me know, because I don't ever like to surprise people, because what'll happen is a month later they'll realize, oh wait, where's that 12th guitar part I put on there? I'm missing it, and then you got to recall the mix. So
Yeah, right.
I'd rather do what they send me, and if I have to change it, I let them know and move on. But it's a good arrangement plays itself, and a bad arrangement is very, very difficult to fix. And so in that case, you keep yelling fire, fire. You just decide, like, okay, listen to this now. Now listen to this, and you create moments and just let things play. But you find who can help you get to the chorus, and then you go with that for a minute, and you just bury everything else.
Okay, so if I hear you correctly, then to you the chorus is the most important section of the song.
Just as an example.
Okay, because I mean, if you look at the anatomy of most songs, you're getting the intro that's kind of up high, and then it comes down for the verse a little bit, and then it's going up on the chorus and whatever. But usually the bridge, it'll either be the loudest thing in the song, most dynamic, or the softest, one or the other, which to me means that it's the dynamic peak of the song, so to speak.
It can be, but harmonically and songwriting-wise, it almost never is. The verse builds tension in some way, either by just staying there and being small, and then if there is a pre-chorus, that really ratchets the tension up, and then the chorus is the release of that tension. Musically, most of the time, well, not most of the time, but a lot of the time, the bridge will be where the song goes somewhere it's never been before, so that when you come back to the song, it's this familiar home place, and you're really glad to be back there. So you go on a journey, and then you come back. So, I mean, that's the way, for me, a lot of songs are built up. So it's getting that resolution of whatever the tension was in the verse, and it could be harmonic, it can be rhythmic, it can be lyric. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. But when you get to the chorus, usually you're trying to pay that off.
Yeah.
So it's relating the chorus to what came before it, and it can be as simple as just have the chorus be 3 times louder than the verse, and it's shocking, and that's the thing that works. Or it can just be making sure that you can really hear the 7th in the chord resolving to the root of the first chord of the chorus. Whatever it is, it's bringing out whatever that musical thing is. And even, this sounds like a very songwritery approach, but every punk band writes songs like this. There is a reason those 3 chords lead to those 3 chords, or they stay on the same 3 chords, but the melody goes up, or there's no melody in the verse, but there's melody in the chorus. So this is an innate thing in any song that works. This isn't like a real chord structure songwritery thing.
Are you writing
My
the
hands are flying up. Just
Well, okay, I'm sorry.
No.
You know what?
No, I wasn't. It's just funny because
No.
they're really going to keep them down, and then as soon as they can feel my sentence coming to the end, it's like, boing!
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to. This is for you guys, so let's just go to your questions.
You sort of have been answering it as you go now, but I was wondering what your background is as in music theory, and like a lot of world music doesn't necessarily have chorus necessarily. It's a wide mix of time signatures and time.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to say the term chorus means nothing. It's a placeholder term for where does this song pay off. And maybe it doesn't, but most musical arrangements pay off somewhere. And if it's more of a classical thing, it might only pay off once, or it might pay off 60 times by constantly doing a chord progression that resolves or something like that. But in a traditional song, it's going to pay off in the chorus. But, my background is I started off playing French horn and then switched to trumpet and realized I wasn't that great and discovered being a geek and then moved into more of the engineering side of things. But, I wanted to be in a rock band when I was a kid. I've been listening to Queen and Jethro Tull, and I want to do that. And the only way I could do it was to do what I do now. So that's what I do. But I listen to tons of music, and usually not at all the kinds of things I usually work on. I listen to mainly classical and jazz at the moment, and a bunch of reggae, because someone gave me this folder full of reggae. And so it's easier for me to listen to stuff outside the genre I work in, because I think people tend, when you, not specialize, but when you're really familiar with a certain style of music, then you start to get really, really particular. Like my favorite stuff in the world is guitar rock, and I like maybe a half of 1% of guitar rock. Whereas classical, at this point, Handel's like a little snoozy for me, but I can listen to probably 90% of all classical music from all periods and get something out of it because it's not as familiar to me. So there aren't things about it that will bother me because I recognize them. So, yeah.
Um, as far as sample rates, do you see a lot of different projects come in at different sample rates?
Yep.
And do you see a big bump in quality on the higher ones, or what are you seeing as far as the trends?
Stuff comes in at all kinds of stuff. I mixed a record recently that was all done at 44.1 16-bit, so I printed my mixes at 44.1 32-bit just because it would be a little better, like whatever. But I'll never change the sample rate of a project. Empirically, 48 will be better than 44.1 because of how you can build filters to get rid of aliasing, etc. There are technical reasons why 44.1 is like pushing it. And 24-bit is obviously more dynamic range than 16-bit. I could make the argument that 96 will sound better than 48 most of the time. It doesn't matter why, but it's basically true. But again, it's to do with overhead in the hardware and stuff like that. But the only way I would say that perhaps higher sample rates would equate to higher sound is that generally the people working at 96 are people who've been making records for a while and are in a studio. Because nobody at home who's just learning how to do stuff even knows that you can change the sample rate. And the default was always 44.1, and I think some of the DAWs now default to 48. And that was a battle to talk to manufacturers and say, how about let's default at 48? Just because then 2/3 of the stuff being done in the world will be done at 48 instead of 44.1. So there are projects I've done, like early on when 96K sort of existed, I worked on an Andrew WK song. And that guy tracks and tracks and tracks and tracks and tracks and tracks and tracks. So we started off at 96K, and I realized after day 1.5 that I was about to run out of voices. I could not finish working on the song, and we were only doing the main riff. We hadn't gotten to the counter melody, and we hadn't even started singing. And like, okay, this is going to be an issue. And so I converted it to 48K during lunch and just kept working, and it actually sounded better. And it's probably because it picked up some distortion along the way, and everything was a little bit louder and a little bit brighter. Like, oh, cool. So that doesn't mean 48K sounds better than 96K. But the record I've just mixed at 44.1 sounds really good to me. So you can do whatever you can do, but all things being equal, if you can move to 48 or move to 96, you should do it and see if you hear a benefit.
I actually have a tracking question. I'm just kind of like mixing and tracking and all this in my home, and I feel like I get really good quality out of pretty much everything except for drums. And I just was kind of curious if you had any tips for obviously not a really great treated tracking space to maybe get better quality, or is it just worth it to just save your money and go to a studio to actually get good tracks?
The great answer is yes, save your money and go to a studio, but that's not always an option. If you're in a substandard room, make it as dead as possible because then the room has less sound to it. So if you're in a rectangular bedroom and you've got a drum kit set up, if you can put carpet up on the walls and tip your mattress on its side, that gets rid of first reflections, it gets rid of direct reflections, it makes the mid-range less harsh, so that will help. You're only ever as good as the weakest link in the chain, and if the weakest link in the chain is the drum kit, then it doesn't matter where you are. You could be in the best studio in the world and it's going to sound like a great recording of a terrible drum kit. So make sure that the drums are tuned and that they're actually in good shape, and you might have to splash out, and it might be better to spend money on drum heads than studio time, to be honest. But you've got to really assess where you are and just try and minimize the problems. Like if you're in a rectangular room, don't set the drums up parallel to the walls. Put them in a corner facing out. And that will immediately make things less regular. You also need to get the mics closer to the drums so you hear less of the room. You can't do a Glyn Johns in a crappy sounding room. It's not going to work. And by the Glyn Johns, it's the 3 mic technique. So you've got to get in close. Hopefully the drums sound good. You've got some decent microphones, and then recreate the room with plugins or compression or distortion or whatever. So.
Some of the mixing you've been doing on site, when you pull it up on the board, it sounds pretty good, smooth. Is it performance? Do you compress on the way in, or the musicians?
How do you mean? You mean like when I'm recording, what do I do? Or
Well, yes, or the tracks you receive.
I mean, for mixing, every song is different because it depends how it was recorded. When I record, I'm finding that as I get better at it, I do less and less and less. Like I worked on a record last year that I was producing, and we were at a studio where all my gear is set up in England. And I didn't even EQ stuff. I would set up a microphone randomly almost, it seemed, push up the fader, like, wow, that sounds great, and then think, oh, well, hold on, should I EQ that? No, that's worse. Should we compress it? No, that's worse. And you just go for it. But the reason is, I think, that, first of all, I like things that sound natural, which you might think is crazy considering how some of my mixes sound. But I actually do like it because I think that is that emotional connection to the tracks. But there's also everything you do to something on the way in changes it and makes it less natural. Like when you put an EQ in, you're introducing phase shift because there are crossovers all through that EQ. So it's just stuff that isn't natural. But this is not the same as when I get something and the whole album has been recorded with just a microphone and a preamp, and that's it, because they say, well, we'll do it later. No, do it now and get it to sound like what you want it to sound like. And I think the more I work on things, the more I can be led by what something sounds like, not what I want it to sound like. So as I push up faders, I'm teaching myself what this song is going to need to be. I don't have a preconceived notion of it. So it doesn't matter what the guitar sounds like, that's the guitar sound. So now, how do I make that guitar sound work in the mix? Not what can I do to that guitar sound to make it sound like more like what I want? Because it's what it does in the mix, not what it sounds like. This would probably come up anyway in response to a question, but my theory, which doesn't always hold true, on any mix is at most there are 4 or 5 things that it matters what they sound like. It might be the entire drum kit, but usually it's the kick and the snare. The vocal, definitely. Might be the bass, might not be the bass. Rhythm guitars, if you're talking about a rock track. That's it. So all of the farfisa organs that come in the chorus, it doesn't matter what they sound like. All that matters is that your balance is really good and you've panned it somewhere where it doesn't step on something else. All of the extra guitars that come in, unless they've got some huge problem, like they've got 5,000 dB at 30 hertz, which you should probably take care of, unless there's something like that, just push up the fader until it sounds good. The worst thing you can do in a mix is to go through every single track and solo it up and make it sound good. Because there is nothing to say that all those sounds are going to work together. Absolutely nothing. And it just puts you down a rabbit hole where you think you've already dealt with stuff and you haven't. So I think there's a question in the back.
Hey, I was wondering what is your opinion and how much while you mix you think about the battle of like the loudness war, and what do you think like while you mix, if you think about like dBSPL or you're trying to reach
Nope.
somewhere, or I mean, how much do you think about the dynamics?
My joke answer is that I won the loudness war. It's over. That Metallica record, I win. So the real answer, though, is that I know my mixes are loud. I have no idea how loud they are, and I don't want to know how loud they are because I don't care. Because the level isn't something that I figure out separate from the mix. The mix ends up the level it is because that's the level it needs to be for it to work for me. And you go through phases, you have things that you like, and then a year later you hear them, and you're like, what the hell was I thinking? I don't like that anymore. And at the moment, especially because I got rid of the compressor on my bus, I think my mixes have a bit more dynamic range than they did 2 years ago. And then I might start smashing the hell out of things again next week. I don't know. It's just about the emotional response to things and can I get the mix to work. So I never think about it. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't. And while you're learning, sometimes it's a great thing to do because it will point out why you might be having trouble. If you're hitting stuff on your mix bus really, really hard, you can't fix it back at the individual tracks. You need to back the whole mix down and give yourself some room. So it's important to be aware of it as you're learning, and then eventually you can ignore it because it will sound too loud, whether or not the meter says it is.
On that similar note, how loud do you listen to your mix as you're mixing it?
I go back and forth between really loud and really quiet. And once the mix is going, it's always really quiet. But that's just peculiar to me. I know there's some people, like Chad Blake is more like a post guy. He actually sets his monitor level and never touches it. And that's how he gauges whether something is working or not, because his speakers are always at exactly the same level. I'm really loud to say, is this pummeling me in the chest the way I want it to? Or really quiet, because that's the only time you can actually hear balance, you can actually assess whether dynamics are working, because you can fool yourself when it's loud, but you can also fool yourself quietly to say, oh, the drums are punchy enough. You've got to hear that loud to know that they're actually really punchy, and you're getting that PA in the chest feeling. So that's the way I do it. I almost never listen at a normal level.
Awesome. Quick question. How do you treat your overheads, especially if you have a hard-hitting drummer?
Obviously it depends on the recording. Usually, though, I would say that there are some harsh frequencies in the cymbals that I do a seek and destroy on. Like, I might notch filter 60 dB out at a certain frequency, because once you get rid of all the stuff that when you crank it up in solo it hurts, then you can crank it up in a mix, and so you can get as much of the air and the wash that you need out of the cymbals. A mistake I hear, not a mistake, a different choice I hear a lot on rock mixes is that the cymbals are really quiet. And probably because cymbals and electric guitars, there's a band called Cymbals Eat Guitars, and that has to be because an engineer told them once when they said, well, how come I can't hear the guitars? Like, oh, dude, the cymbals eat the guitars. That's an excuse. You need to be able to hear both. But in most rock tracks, when you get to something like the chorus or a loud bridge or something like that, all the energy of the track is in that high frequency, constant slab that's coming out of the cymbals. You turn that down, it loses potential. There's no way it can be as energetic as when they're loud. But when they're loud, they eat everything. So I'm usually trying to get rid of every harsh frequency and let them live above the guitars and maybe a little bit below the guitars, but not right in the same space that the guitar and vocal are.
When mixing rock bands like Linkin Park that have these high gain rhythm guitars, synthesizers, and vocals all trying to live like in the mid range, how do you get that all to sit properly in the mix and have its own space without conflicting? Like, how do you get that to coexist in the mid range?
It's the same thing. I mean, if you've got distorted electric guitars and a keyboard playing the exact same part, probably the guitars are more important in the mid-range and the keyboard has some fuzzy thing up top, but it can be just about balance and not about anything other than balance and panning. You know, if you offset the pans a little bit, they start to poke their heads out and say, oh, I'm over here and I'm a keyboard. And so it might be that you can carve a hole in one of them to let the other one come out, or it might just be balance and panning.
Hey, Andrew, I got a question. When you're cleaning your tracks, how deep do you get involved in that before you start mixing? And the second question is, tell us a little bit about how you gain stage.
So how do you mean by cleaning?
Just cleaning up some of the background noise, some of the other instruments, and things like that.
I generally don't do a lot of that unless I have to. I delete empty audio. Like if someone sends me a session that's just wall-to-wall wave files, I'll get rid of all the empty wave files. toms on a rock drum kit, I will go through and chop every single one of them because you'll never set a gate properly for every tom hit in a song. So those I do manually, that kind of thing. Past that, I get rid of, I actually spend a lot of time doing noise reduction on things, to be honest. Getting rid of AC hum on the bass DI. Because when you do a rough mix and things aren't EQ'd and everything's kind of low, you don't hear that stuff. But as soon as you start mixing, so you really hear everything, because that's my style of mixing, is you hear everything. Everything's loud all the time. That stuff really starts to stick out and bug me. So Isotope RX7 is genius for that stuff. And I spend a lot of time doing that kind of cleanup. But I don't go looking for it. It's while I'm mixing, I hear the hum, and I'm like, oh, I can live with that. And then I hear it again, it'll be fine. And I go, all right, now I got to deal with it. And then I go off and I deal with it. So it's always reacting to things. And gain staging is just like the answer to the other question. I have absolutely no idea. I know when I'm hitting all my stuff too loud and I pull tracks down. But it's just, now it's just from listening. When I had the compressor on my mix bus, I always knew when I was hitting it too hard because it would just sound like I was hitting it too hard. So then to confirm it, I open up the plug-in and like, yep, there you go. It's more than 4 dB of compression. That's too much. But it's just getting used to the way stuff sounds. So I don't have a method to that at all.
Hi there. I had the pleasure of working with Andy Johns years ago, and you said something a few questions ago that reminded me of a conversation I had with him when you were talking about muting tracks and soloing tracks and doing a mix and this and that, compression, whatnot on those. And he said that he starts with everything when it comes to mixing, and he doesn't just do one thing at a time, and he starts with the whole thing and then puts it together. So yeah, that.
Well, one of my favorite studio stories is Glyn Johns, who's, if you don't know the Johns, Glyn and Andy Johns were brothers, did Stones, just everything. And Glyn's son, Ethan, is an amazing producer and engineer now, who's still making great records. But Glyn Johns was producing Benmont Tench's solo record. Benmont Tench, keyboard player with Tom Petty, among other people. One of those musicians who plays all the notes that fell out of your song that you forgot you needed to play, and once he's played them, you're like, oh my God, how could I ever have listened to this song without it? He's one of those just magic musicians. Doing a solo record, they were mixing, which is, half an hour at the end of the day, not the 2-day nightmare that mixing has become for most things. And Benmont came in and said, oh, it sounds beautiful. Can we just hear it with a little more bass? And Glyn said, sure, and pulled all the faders down because he was going to start over. And Ben was like, whoa, what do you mean? Why didn't we just? He's like, well, I can't do that. Give me a few minutes. Completely remix the song and had more bass. But that's the approach. It's not, you can't just turn the bass up. The bass ended up the level it was because of everything else on the song. So you turn that up, like, okay, in the moment, maybe that fixes it, but that might not be right. So we completely rebuilt the balance of the song in 10 minutes with more bass.
Boy, talk about old school, huh?
Yes.
We have time for one more question.
Going to the back, apparently.
I was just wondering, you use a lot of parallel compression. I know that sometimes Pro Tools has problems with delay compensation.
No, it doesn't.
No? Okay.
No, there were old bugs with delay compensation when you had a stereo bus and the left and the right needed to have separate delays and things like that. They're used with that, but that was fixed a long time ago. Where you can have problems that you think are delay compensation problems is when you use something in parallel that isn't phase coherent. And the things that aren't phase coherent is every single multiband compressor on the planet except the linear multiband compressor, because it's got crossovers that have phase shifts. So when you blend that in, now you've got phase shift, but only at certain frequencies, and it'll sound like it's a delay compensation problem. But Pro Tools, unless you're working on HDX, and then you get to past its limit, which, because it's actually a memory-based delay for HDX as opposed to a software-based delay, their delay compensation is actually dead on. It's really, really good now. So there used to be issues, but yes, you can have problems. And other things that are not phase coherent, something like the Sanzant plugin is not phase coherent because it's splitting stuff into bands, and there are 4 different distortion circuits. So you might hear something if you use it parallel, but if you don't like what it's doing, then just use something else. You know, but those should really be the only problems you're having. If you're having other problems, then either the plugin isn't reporting its delay properly, or something's really broken somewhere.
So with that, boy, this was a great session. Excellent. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
So those of you who have questions, if you can take it up with Andrew outside in the hall, that'd be great.
And to warn you, I only have a little bit because then I got to go racing off. Now, is that fine-looking woman at the back of the room in here next?
She is.
You guys don't want to go anywhere. Forget about me.
Sylvia Massey is
here.
coming up. Yes.
Look, I want to say something on microphone. I said yesterday, when you weren't around, I think you'd already left the Waves booth, but anybody whose studio stories will invariably include potato sausages and shotguns, how can you go wrong? So anyway, Sylvia Massey.
Yeah. Andrew Scheps.